Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Back in high school, I lived with my mom out in the country. Not like Deliverance territory, there was reception and decent internet out there, and the nearest neighbors weren't 10 miles away. You didn't hear banjo music out in the woods or anything. But we were a good 25-minute drive from the nearest town, not counting little gas stations that dotted the area here and there. Next to the house there was a dead-end road. I can't remember the name, as this was years ago, but I always used to take walks up and down that road after school or on weekends, especially when the weather was nice. Sometimes I'd go all the way to the end, sometimes just halfway. There were houses down the road, of course, but there were abandoned structures too, stuff like abandoned trailers and ramshackle barns. I've always been sort of interested in urban exploration, but back then I didn't have my own car, so it was kind of hard to get to places that seemed cool enough to explore. There was one place in particular that always intrigued me. It was a barn, set next to an abandoned farmhouse behind a fence, one of those black iron fences that you see in cliché haunted house movies. Me and some friends had actually run into the guy who owned the land at one point, and he said he didn't mind us poking around out there as long as we weren't doing anything illegal or defacing the property or anything. My friends and I were never into being dicks like that, so it never even occurred to us, and we thanked him for the opportunity. One day during the summer I had two of my best friends over. We spent most of the day playing Guitar Hero and Quake 3 and whatnot, but eventually the video games got boring. It was a nice day, and it was getting late, somewhere around 5 or 6 p.m. if I remember correctly, so I brought up the idea of taking a walk down the dead-end road. They both agreed that going outside would be a nice change, and we grabbed a few water bottles and headed out. On the way down the road, I mentioned the house and barn to my friends, and they agreed that this would be a good time to go exploring. We're all a little weird in that we like being scared, and the country can get pretty creepy at night with all the weird sounds of nature around you. We made our way to the house, climbed the fence, and dropped down into the yard. The house was almost totally full of hay, which we thought was strange, but I was more interested in the barn anyway. We went inside and started poking around, looking at all the old, rusted farm equipment, but unfortunately, there wasn't much of interest inside. We went outside to the back of the barn to see where it led, and we were surprised and pretty excited to see that it went down a path into the woods. We didn't even think twice before going down the path. We only walked for a couple minutes before the path opened up into a big, wide clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. It felt pretty surreal, and we all split off in different directions and wandered around the clearing for a little while. Then my friend called us over from the left side of the clearing. He was looking down at something on the ground, only about 10 or 15 feet from the tree line. We went over to see what it was, and to our surprise, it was a big burn pit, probably 5 by 5 feet. There were old cans, mugs, and other burned up junk all piled haphazardly into this pit, and we decided to poke through it to see if there was anything valuable or just cool that we could take back as a memento. We'd only been digging for a minute or so when my friend pulled up a small white object that I immediately recognized as a bone. This didn't strike me as odd at first, since a lot of hunters around that area will toss unwanted animal remains into burn pits on their property as a convenient way to get rid of them. But as we dug deeper, we kept pulling more bones out, and they started getting bigger. Like, uncomfortably big. When my friend yanked one out that was about the size of my forearm, I decided we needed to figure out what the hell was going on. My dad is a medical professional, and one of his specialties is reading X-rays, meaning he can identify bones pretty much at a glance, so I took a picture of the bone pile and sent it to him, saying something like, "Hey Dad, me and some buddies just found these out in a field. Can you tell what they're from?" I got his response about 30 seconds later. "Those look human, son." I showed my friends the text and they kind of nervously laughed, but I didn't find this shit funny at all. We'd been out for almost 2 hours, which meant that it was almost dark, and the last thing I wanted was to be caught out in the middle of nowhere in some psycho's murder pit. As soon as that thought crossed my mind, we heard something from the tree line, like a branch snapping under someone's foot. Every trace of laughter died, and we all snapped around to look at the tree line. Nobody moved until that snapping sound came again, and this time I saw some kind of figure moving around in there, looking like someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. I screamed, "Go," and we all took off, basically non-stop sprinting all the way back to my house without looking back. For some stupid reason that I still don't understand, we didn't call the cops. None of us were comfortable around police officers, and though my dad urged me to at least send an anonymous tip, we never did. I went back out to that area a few weeks later in broad daylight carrying my machete, and the burn pit and bones were gone. There were still scorch marks around where it had been, obviously, and a few pieces of trash still there, but the evidence, if that's what it was, had vanished. I still wonder about that pit sometimes, and I wonder if we inadvertently stumbled into some kind of burial site where a murderer routinely came to revisit the scene of the crime. I know that sounds dramatic and cliché, but it makes the most sense in my mind. Sometimes I regret not calling the cops, but there's nothing I can do about it now.
So, my family on my dad's side is from Texas, around the Padre Island area. Close to the beach, but close to some really shitty, slummy areas, too. Not quite projects bad, but definitely places where you need to lock your car and your front door, especially at night. Normally, when we'd visit, we'd stay with my grandma or my aunt, both of whom lived fairly close to each other. Usually we stayed with grandma, because she just enjoyed company more, being an older woman who lived alone with most of her kids moved away to different states. There was one day where me, my mom, and my aunt were out just doing whatever shopping, hitting the beach, walking the boardwalk, because it was a really nice day. We normally tried to visit during the spring or fall months, because as anyone from Texas knows, summers are unbearably hot. I was around 10 or so when this story took place. We stayed out until around 10 p.m. or so, but when we got back to my grandma's house, the door was locked, and she wasn't answering. There wasn't a spare key, and we had no idea where she could have gone, because she doesn't drive. It wasn't that big a deal because we could just stay with my aunt, but some of our personal belongings were in my grandma's house, so we needed to get in. There was a little strip a good ways down the road, practically visible from the house, with a payphone. One of the things left inside the house was my aunt's cell phone, and my mom didn't have grandma's number programmed into her phone, so we headed over to the market to call her and see what was up. It turned out that one of her friends had come and picked her up, and she had just forgotten to call and let us know that she probably wouldn't be home until later. Again, not really a big deal, but my aunt was kind of pissed because she needed her cell phone in case work called or whatnot. I wasn't too worried, because I had my Game Boy, and I was pretty immersed in whatever game I was playing. My aunt left the driver's side door hanging open when she stepped out to use the payphone. My mom, obviously, was in the passenger seat, and as soon as I heard the tone in her voice when she whispered, "Who the hell is that?" I knew something was wrong. I looked up and saw a guy in a faded jacket and ripped-up jeans coming out from around the side of the building. There were a few other buildings in the darkness behind the lot we were in, so I can only guess he came from one of those. For all I know, those buildings were crack houses, and that wouldn't have been out of place in this particular part of town. The guy's face had a weird, deadpan look to it, like he wasn't all there. Looking back, he was almost certainly on something. He stumbled over to the car, half yelling slurred words, and circled around to the open driver's side door, where he leaned down and started to reach in towards my mom. My mom screamed, and my aunt turned around and started yelling at the guy to get the F back. He turned towards her when she yelled at him, and even then, I realized she had fucked up by not attacking him while his attention was still focused on my mom. The guy started towards her, kind of shambling like a Romero-style zombie. She circled around the car and he followed, suddenly picking up the pace like he was seriously trying to grab her. She got around him, jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and reversed so hard the tires squealed. The guy stumbled after a car for a second before turning around and heading back in the direction of the buildings behind the lot. We took off down the street back to my grandma's house. My aunt's boyfriend at the time was the chief of police, so she called him, and within 5 minutes a group of police cruisers came flying into the parking lot. We could see the commotion from down the street. From what I remember, they didn't arrest anyone, but a bunch of people took off running from behind the building the moment the cops showed up. I have no idea if that guy was planning on stealing the car, robbing us, raping my mom and aunt, or all three, but that experience still stands out to me as scary as shit, and I'm glad I'll never have to find out.
Back in 2013, my best friend and I were on the verge of moving out and getting our own apartment for the very first time. Naturally, we were excited, but before we could seal the deal we'd have to road trip up to Maryland so I could receive the inheritance money my grandmother left me when she died. It wasn't a huge trust fund, something like $17,000, but it would be enough to get us started, and my friend had a pretty sizable chunk squirreled away at that point as well. The drive was going to be about 12 hours, but on the way there we thought we'd stop in Ohio for the night to visit Kings Island. My friend's family had season passes, and we figured it would be easier to break the trip up into 2 6-hour segments. Kings Island was awesome. We both love roller coasters, and we went on a Wednesday during the school year, so there was virtually no one in the park. The employees would usually just let us ride the coasters over and over as many times as we wanted. The concession stands, as always, were money traps, but we didn't even care because we were having so much fun. Later that afternoon, maybe around 3 or 4, we were starting to get slightly bored of all the rides, since we'd done all of them multiple times by now, and we were wandering around the park aimlessly, talking about the new apartment and my new girlfriend and other mundane shit. We were on the far side of the park, where there weren't really any rides or game booths, or even concession stands for that matter. We walked along the fence until we noticed a little path leading further out towards the western side of the park. Since we were so bored, we decided to take it and see where it ended up. It was a little concrete walkway that zigzagged between the fences on either side, and we eventually saw that it led to a small building. It was a little bigger than a normal-sized shack. It only had one window that we could see, and instead of a door, there was just a big opening that led inside. It was pitch black beyond that opening, and there was a faded Halloween-style sign leaning up against one corner of the building, along with some wisps of fake cobwebs dangling from the ceiling. This was the reason neither of us freaked out upon seeing the dismembered torso sticking halfway out of the entryway. Obviously the building was some sort of haunted house attraction, and since it was the middle of spring, it wasn't being used. We walked closer, wondering if there were any park employees around to stop us from going in and exploring this unused attraction. But I started to notice that, with every step we'd take, my gut began to feel more and more uneasy, like something about the situation was just off. At first I tried to chalk it up to us being in such a quiet, deserted area of the park, but soon it got too strong for me to keep up that lie. I glanced at my friend, and I could tell he was feeling the same sense of unease that I was. We stopped along the path, maybe 30 feet from the building. I squinted at the torso decoration. From here it didn't look like a decoration, it looked as real as a movie prop, or as a real mutilated body. I have no idea if it was my imagination. It very well could have been, given how freaked out I was by this point, but I thought I could pick up a whiff of decay, that sickly sweet odor of rot that anyone who's ever stumbled over a putrefying carcass in the woods knows well. I glanced at my friend again, and he was looking at me and then back to the body as if trying to ask a question without speaking. I asked him, "Do you think it's real?" He was about to respond when we heard something shuffling around inside the shack, sounding way too big to be a mouse or raccoon or something. We took off, suddenly realizing with perfect clarity that there was absolutely no one around to help us if the situation did turn dangerous. We spent the rest of the day talking about what had happened, and decided not to call the cops or anything because of how fucking stupid we'd look if we got the police involved over a discarded Halloween decoration. A couple hours later we headed back to our motel, which was right down the road from the park. I woke up that night to a clattering sound at the door to our room. We'd gotten one of those cheap, shitty motels with the doors on the outside, so naturally it wasn't the most reputable place around. It was probably just some drunk person forgetting which room was theirs, but my mind immediately went to the weird shit that had gone down at the park earlier that day, and how close our motel was to it. I started wondering if whoever had been in that shack, if there really was someone, could have followed us back here to silence us. The rattling continued for another minute or so before it stopped, and whoever was outside moved on. I took the desk chair and jammed it against the door as a precaution, and the next day we got up, checked out, and made it the rest of the way to Maryland without any further incidents. We still talk about that day sometimes, and I took one thing away from it: trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. It's better to be paranoid and alive than brave and dead.
Me, 16 or so. Parents are divorced. I spend alternating weekends with my dad out in a little cabin in the country. Very isolated. We didn't have high-speed internet out there and just got basic cable. Dad and I head to Walmart one evening for groceries. It's about an hour drive there and back. It's summer, so the windows are down, air is warm and comfy, and it's getting pretty dark out, probably around 8 p.m. or so. Dad and I are shooting the shit, mostly talking about music. Notice something flying overhead outside. Dad slows down to almost a complete stop since we're on an unpopulated back road, and we look out at the thing. It's flying very, very low, but we can't seem to hear it making any kind of sound. It's shaped sort of like an oval, like one of those ships from Star Wars. Crisscrossing all over the bottom are what look like red lines, like circuitry or something. There's also something moving on one side, like a rotating wheel or something. Every other rotation it would glint blue, a really dark shade of blue similar to the shade of the red lines. We watched it until it passed out of sight and talked about it non-stop for the rest of the drive home. Still no clue what it was. There are no aircraft bases around here that I know of. My dad is a skeptic, but we still talk about that thing, and he has no idea what to make of it either. Not really scary, but an interesting experience with possible A's involved, I'd like to think. One more UFO story before I go make breakfast. This is from my mom's perspective, several years before she and my dad met.
B-Mom, early 30s I'd guess. Live in rural Maryland, work as a typist for a local newspaper. Driving home one night along a country road surrounded by fields and a few tall farmhouses. Notice something flying low overhead, too low to be a plane. Stop and roll down window to look. Object is a big black triangle with a bright light on the front point, and it's silently hovering at the third story of one of the farmhouses. Close enough that if whoever was in that third-floor room looked out the window they'd be face to face with it. Watch until it starts to move away, following the road completely silently. Put car in gear and follow it. It immediately changes its course and heads over the field to the left where it can't be followed, still totally silent, until it's out of sight. This was like the late 70s, so no cell phones, but my mom told my dad this story some time after they met, and he confirmed having seen something matching her description exactly a few years earlier. It's apparently one of the more common UFO sightings, and I've heard several explanations for possible government testing stealth crafts, like the purported TR-3A Black Manta.
This story might not be that interesting and there's no satisfying ending, but it's the creepiest thing that's happened to me while camping, and I've been meaning to write it down for a while. Last year, a couple of friends and I decided to spend the first weekend of our spring break from college by taking a weekend camping trip somewhere relatively far away. We had recently had some bad rain, snowstorms that made us anxious to get out of the area and enjoy some fairer weather in the outdoors. We settled on George Washington and Jefferson National Forest in Virginia and figured the scenery and hiking trails would be worth the almost 6-hour drive. We sat in traffic during a torrential downpour as we made our way out of Philadelphia, but the subsequent time spent on the road was very pleasant. Due to the traffic, we had gotten a late start on leaving, and we finally got into the area we planned to look for a campsite around dusk. Being cheap and confident in our ability to manage ourselves in the woods, we opted not to reserve a site in an established campground and instead planned to drive down some Forest Service roads until we found a decent enough area to park our car and put together a temporary campsite. It was dark by the time we found the road we had previously decided to explore. I hadn't realized what kind of terrain we'd be trying to camp and was a bit disappointed to find that the road was a relatively steep passage up the side of a mountain. In the back of our minds, though, we thought it would be cool to camp on the mountain, and we hoped to find a spot overlooking the small town we could see in the distance. The moon was very bright, and the wind was blowing quite hard as we drove up the road. When I tell this story to people, I tell them to picture the atmosphere of a stereotypical horror movie scene with howling wind and a big full moon. Every so often, there would be a little pull-off area on the side of the road just big enough to fit our car. Each time, we would stop and get out with our flashlights to find a clearing or any spot that seemed fit to camp, really hoping for a fire pit someone had already made. After doing this several times without finding anything, we started to get nervous but resolved to keep going. Finally, we saw what looked to be an intersection with another road that went uphill to our right. As we got closer, we realized it wasn't really a road, but a wide path that led to a clearing we could barely make out through the trees. We parked the car at the entrance and started walking up the path. Still, the wind was howling loudly, and the moonlight was obscured by the dense cover of trees. Nearing the clearing, I immediately saw that there were the remains of a large fire towards the far edge. We were relieved that we had finally found somewhere at least feasible to camp, even though we knew we still had to set up in the dark. We approached the far edge of the clearing and could see that the pile of charred wood and coals was likely not a fire pit made by campers, but rather a bonfire where people might gather to drink, party in the woods. I scanned the surrounding area with my flashlight and instantly saw a decaying deer carcass at the tree line just past the remains of the bonfire. I pointed the deer out to the other guys, and they too beamed their flashlights around us. Someone else then spotted another carcass much closer to us to our right in the clearing. This one was definitely not a deer, and the skull looked like that of a dog. Most of the fur and flesh were gone from it except for the back legs and paws. The fur there was a grayish-brown color that made me think it might have been a coyote. To our surprise, we saw another partially decayed animal to our left. It also looked like a dog, but I couldn't make out any identifying details. At this point, all of us were extremely creeped out and were in unspoken agreement to get the fuck out of there. We basically sprinted back to the car and turned it around as fast as we could. As we drove back down the road in the direction we came from, we were terrified of seeing headlights or running into a closed gate or something. We got back to the main road without incident and headed back into town, where we decided to rent a hotel room for the night. Talking about it afterwards, everyone else agreed that all of 3 of the carcasses were definitely dogs and that I was mistaken in thinking one was a deer. I don't remember the scene that well, as it all happened within the span of a few seconds. For some additional details, we also saw a lot of trash strewn about the clearing, including a broken Bic lighter and a used condom in the bonfire. In summary, we found 3 dead dogs practically arranged around the remains of a bonfire in a pretty remote section of the woods. We debated calling the Forest's district office and reporting what we saw, but never followed through with it. The next day we went to a campground within the forest and paid to reserve a site. I still have no idea what an explanation for that shit could be and don't really care to find out.
OP here, been racking my brain for any other weird shit that's happened to me, and I remembered this one. It's not much, not even really worth a green text, but I'll go ahead and post. When my friend and I lived in our first apartment several years back, the one we got after the Maryland trip, we usually left all the lights off because we were antisocial depressed fucks. He actually made a cot in his closet and slept in it, and I set up a little computer den in mine, which is where I'd spend almost all of my time unless I was sleeping. Like I said, pathetic and depressed. But at one point while I was in the bathroom drunk as shit as like 2 a.m., I had the lights off because my throbbing head couldn't deal with the shitty fluorescence, and I started noticing really faintly glowing handprints on the walls. They were like that soft yellow-green glow those cheap glow-in-the-dark sticky hands gave off, the ones you got out of the 25-cent gumball machines that were entirely useless a day later because they had collected too much carpet fuzz and dirt. They were almost invisible sometimes, but they were everywhere in there. I woke up my friend and showed him, and he told me he'd seen the same thing in his closet, but he hadn't said anything because he'd been wasted and almost passed out anyway. We went into his closet and looked, and sure enough, they were everywhere in there too. We actually watched a couple fade in, like something was making the handprint in real time. We weren't really spooked, just curious about it, and it became a joke that we had playful ghost children living in our apartment with us. Nothing creepy or unnerving ever happened, but we saw those handprints every time we'd turn out the lights until we moved out. Just something kinda weird and kinda cool I thought I'd share.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.